Let the show begin. Welcome to the Podcast Editor Mastermind Show with me, Jennifer Longworth.
Brian Ensminger.
Daniel Abendroth.
And today's special guest, Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And if anyone has any comments while you're watching live, you can drop them in the Facebook comments. We do this every other Thursday around 10:05 p.m. Eastern time, or you can join us live and comment, or just catch us on the podcast and subscribe and like and share and all that good stuff. So, Gordon, the entertainment lawyer, the podcast lawyer, tell me a little bit about how you got into being a podcast lawyer.
Well, I started I was a lawyer first, and then I started a podcast. And because I do entertainment and media law, the connection was natural. And I went actually looking for the legal stuff for myself, so I knew I would be doing things right. And I realized it wasn't out there. So I wrote a book, and I started creating forms and templates for podcasters to use, and offering services to podcasters and production podcast companies and things like that. And so now here I am representing podcasters.
Very good.
Yeah. So I think our audience is typically more the podcast editors rather than the podcasters.
Yeah.
And so like there are some typical questions I think that we often hear from podcasters. We've got some different questions, right? So like for me, I'm always interested in making sure that I'm covered from a legal perspective, right?
Sure.
So I like my first thought is when I bring on a new client, what are the kinds of things that I might need to consider having in a contract or a service agreement or like that kind of thing?
Well, I think it is important to have a service agreement between you and your clients, just so that they know what they're supposed to be getting in exchange for what they pay, and you know what you're supposed to be getting in exchange for what you do. And just so that the understandings are very clear. So the obvious things are how much you get paid and what specific services you're rendering. Now, quantifying that is sometimes a challenge, because sometimes it takes you hours and hours and hours to edit an episode, and sometimes you can do it very quickly. I was talking to somebody earlier today who does it visually and spots the ums and things just on this waveform, doesn't even bother to listen through. I mean, listens after the fact, but just double check.
Yeah, but I guess so.
I mean, if you have a known quantity of a host, I guess you can sort of figure out when there's big gaps and things like that. Obviously, anyway, so he does a sort of a rough cut. But the point is, if you're going to do it that way, you probably want to articulate, this is how we operate, and here's what we expect from each other. And, I think you probably want to have something in your contract that protects you against the host including something in the show that they shouldn't have, or asking you to include something for them that they shouldn't, and vice versa. You got to protect them, or it's called indemnification, right? The indemnity, the hold harmless clause, against any mistakes that you might make that cause them problems. So it's a two-way street. I think this is one of those areas where the playing field's pretty level, and it's reasonable for everybody to expect each other to look out for themselves and each other. So, I mean, other than that, the payment terms can be a pretty significant issue. If you're expecting to be paid immediately on delivery of your episodes and they don't pay, what do you do? So choice of forum. Where do you go to court if you have to go to court? All those kinds of things. It's contract boilerplate. There's nothing particularly magical about this kind of a contract.
Yeah, and it maybe doesn't seem magical to you, but to me, it seems quite magical. It seems a bit like a dark art, and so that's why some of these questions about like what kinds of things should be included. You mentioned that there need to be some indemnifications in there for maybe things being included that shouldn't, or that kind of thing. What are some of those maybe watch out type things?
Well, that actually, the indemnification is basically saying, look, if I don't keep my promises to you, I'm going to make you whole if it costs you money or liability. So it's really about, what are you promising? And the promises are usually called representations and warranties in the contract. So you want to make sure the dark art, I love it. I need a wizard's hat and robe. the warranties and warranties and representations should be, promises about what the content is going to include and not include, that it's not going to infringe people's copyrights, that it's original work with whoever's creating the work. Now, you guys as editors, you're working with somebody else's material. So it's really incumbent on them to make sure it's original and not infringing, and that they don't say something that defames another person or invades somebody's privacy or causes them some kind of harm, reveals private information. But as editors, I think, you guys should, try to listen for that stuff and make sure, you understand the law around these areas, but don't promise that you're going to do that for them, that you're going to make sure they don't infringe. You don't want your podcaster getting sued and say, well, my editor should have known to cut that out.
Yeah.
Right. So you're editing, you shouldn't be content editor. You should be technical quality kind of, well, and maybe you are a content editor. If that's the case, say so and be prepared.
Right. I think that it takes it to a little bit about sentences, words.
Yeah. Well, when you're, did I miss something? I'm saying you shouldn't be editing to change the content of the messages that are being said. I mean, if a guest says something and says, "Oh, I shouldn't have said that," of course you're going to cut that out. Right. But you're not going to change the meaning of the sentences they said.
Right.
And your hosts shouldn't expect you to do that. I would say that's dishonest.
Yeah.
So transparently, every time I hear from you or every time I talk to you, I get more and more nervous about my contracts.
No.
I'm doing my job. You're going to have to hire me to fix it for you. No, I'm sorry. That is how lawyers are taught to market. Scare them so they have to hire you.
Oh man!
But that's not my intention here. I do want to shed some light on these things. So
yeah.
Content editing. Heather has a question. Is that more than editing crutch words? Frankenstein editing?
I think what I was referring to is more of the Frankenstein kind of stuff. If you're just editing crutch words or pauses and, the knows and the ums that I use a lot, then I don't think you're changing the meaning. You might be changing the impression that the audience gets of the person. But you have to be really mindful. This is, look, you have a lot of power in your hands to take someone's words and change the cadence of what they're saying, or change the, maybe not even the sequence, but you can make somebody come off like a fool, or you can make a foolish person come off like a genius in the way you edit their stuff. And so I think that, while you want to do what you can to be flattering, you also don't want to cross a line where you're deceiving the audience, because then the audience might be upset with the podcaster, and that's your client. You have to serve your clients and their audiences at the same time.
So to kind of maybe ask a little bit deeper on that, right? So my goal is always to make everybody sound as good as they possibly can.
Okay.
I do my best not to change content, but I will absolutely remove crutch words and repeated phrases, and sometimes, very rarely, circuitous parts of answers. I'll realign audio so that you can actually hear when they were talking over each other. You can hear that stuff. Like, assuming there is a line, where is that line?
I don't know that there is a clear line. I mean, I think that's something that you guys have to use your judgment about. And I guess what you want to do with your contracts and with your relationships with your clients is set the boundaries for how far you're willing to go, what they're expecting of you in that. If let's face it, if I want to do a show where I do a takedown of someone and I invite them on as a guest and I interview them, I could theoretically instruct my editor, hey, let's make this guy sound worse than he is. Or let's emphasize, maybe it wouldn't go that far, but we're going to emphasize, the dirty tricks or whatever this person's talking about. And the deep fake thing is an issue these days. So I guess if you're going to be doing that kind of work, if you're asked to do that kind of work, maybe your contract needs to specify that they're going to indemnify you and hold you harmless against that, even though you're the one who's doing the editing. You're doing it at their instruction, right? It's still okay. I mean, I guess, look, if they're willing to pay you to do it, maybe you want to do it. That's a moral, philosophical discussion. Where's that line? That's for you to decide.
Wow.
Thanks for the help.
Well, draw the line and then put it in the contract. That's the point. Decide how far you're willing to go and what the boundaries for you are, and be transparent about that with your clients.
So Carrie has a question. Goes back to what you mentioned earlier. If the client decides not to pay, who owns the edited audio?
Well, interestingly, it isn't really about whether you get paid or not. The money changing hands doesn't affect the ownership of we're going to talk about the copyright in the work.
Okay.
The basic rule is that when people get together to work on something together, they own it jointly. If I sit down and record something by myself, I own that recording. But then if I give you the material and ask you to edit it, that editorial output, I think, belongs to you unless we have a contract that says otherwise. But if we have that contract that says otherwise and I don't pay you, I still own what the contract says. You just have a right to sue me for the money.
Okay.
So, I mean, until the contract is actually rendered void, and that kind of a breach of contract generally doesn't just end the contract and treat it as if it didn't exist. The sequence of things matters, I guess you could say. So until the contract is terminated, its provisions still govern. So does that make sense?
Makes sense to me.
I think so. And maybe just to kind of peel back the curtain, the way I've got it written in mine is that I own the edited content until they pay. And that's actually in the contract.
I mean, I think that's certainly a clear expression of your intent. I'm not sure that from a legal standpoint, it works that way. The copyright law is written the way it's written. And unfortunately, I think you're probably okay. And you're not going to, I'm going to say no more about that because you're not going to encounter people who are going to have the legal guns to challenge it.
And we should probably also pause here to say that we've asked Gordon on as an expert, but he's not actually our attorney in this situation. So he's not actually able to give us this kind of advice. So we don't want to put him in a bad situation.
Well, I mean, let's face it. If you're getting your legal advice from a forum like this, or you're getting what you're paying for.
Yeah.
It's worth exactly what you pay. And no, I mean, you really shouldn't rely on this kind of thing or really anything you find online. And even my own materials, I do offer a lot of advice and I am an expert in this field, but I'm not your lawyer unless you hire me as your lawyer. And so you really shouldn't take your advice exclusively from Facebook forums and internet sites and things.
Yeah. So when you mentioned copyright, that takes my mind to trademarking as well. And I see on your screen the podcast lawyer TM. So you are claiming that. Are you in the process of registering that as well?
I have not actually filed a registration for that. And the reason is that in order to be registrable as a trademark, the mark itself has to be distinctive, not descriptive or generic. And the podcast lawyer is pretty darn descriptive, isn't it? So my reason for putting TM, and actually technically it probably should be SM for service mark because I offer services. But the reason I put the TM there is to sort of put the world on notice that I am working in the direction of building, of it becoming a distinctive phrase to identify me. There's this notion of something called acquired distinctiveness from a secondary meaning. So when the public starts to connect Payless shoes with a particular store or chain of stores, they know that's coming from that particular. So now Payless is no longer a descriptive term. It's a secondarily descriptive or distinctive term. So that's why I'm using TM and putting it out there as much as I can so that a year from now I can register it and claim that distinctiveness. So
I'm bourbon barrel podcasting and trying to set myself up as an expert in Lexington, Kentucky, and am working with a gal to start, exploring that of being a trademark. What are the benefits to doing that? I mean, other than having a little R by my name and make myself really, really cool, Well,
the main thing is it gives you the ammunition to use if somebody else comes along and starts Bourbon Barrel Audio or Bourbon Valley Recording Services or editing and whatever. You can say, no, that's too close. That's in the same category of services that I'm in. And we can't have that kind of confusion in the marketplace. So it gives you the ammunition to stop them. Yeah, and so that's the primary reason. And frankly, putting the world on notice in the public registry of the it's called the Gazette of the Copyright Office. Excuse me, the Trademark Office. Anybody who's going to run a search is going to find that information, and you're supposed to run a search before you adopt a brand. So,
right.
I would recommend it. Also, that's the Bourbon Barrel Podcasting. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Bourbon barrels have nothing to do with podcasting, so that mark would be distinctive. It's fanciful, even if you're podcasting about the bourbon business.
Cool.
I think you got a good one there.
Awesome. Thank you.
But don't take your legal advice from us.
Right.
So as far as like protecting yourself, I know a question that comes up a lot when it comes to podcast editors is whether or not they should register as an LLC or like a business entity or be a sole proprietor or whatnot. So can you give a clarification between like what that is and what kind of consideration you should take before making that decision?
Sure. So forming an entity, which is essentially a separate person in the eyes of the law. Bottom line is, if you don't form anything, if you don't do anything, you're a sole proprietorship, and you and your business stuff are intermixed and all one blob there in the eyes of the law. If you form a partnership with one other person and you just start up without doing any government filings or anything like that, same thing. The two partners are equally and jointly liable for everything that happens in their business. So the idea behind forming a corporation or a limited liability company, these are just two flavors of these other kinds of entities, is to insulate the owners, that's you guys, from the business risks and liabilities, essentially. So you're running it as a separate business. Keeping things separate is the way you avoid having someone end up owning your house or your pension plan because you had a mistake that happened in the business. So it's just isolating the risks and rewards from things. And I think it's just smart and good business if the cost benefit and that analysis makes sense. I was on a panel with Podfest last week, and one of the other lawyers said, "You absolutely always form an LLC." And I said, "Well, here in California, the taxes on an LLC can be really burdensome." And this lawyer didn't know that it's $800 minimum, and it steps up, and it's tied to gross receipts, not net. So you could have a business that generates millions of dollars in revenue and has millions of dollars in costs and almost no net profit, and you'd still be paying big taxes based on that gross. So there are some situations where it probably doesn't make sense, but I think for most businesses, most editors or what do you call them, service providers, it makes sense to keep that stuff separate, and it's worth a couple of $100 a year in added costs and hassles to do. And the startup cost of forming it is a little more than that, but it's one-time cost. So.
And always keep your finances separate.
I would say even if you're not forming an entity, have a separate bank account for the business stuff, just so you can track it.
Yeah.
So you're not, you're stopping at Jack in the Box on the way home from dropping the kids off at school. That's not going to show up as a business expense. The IRS does not like that. Why are you charging us for hash browns?
But if you think about work while you're doing it, is that a business meal?
Oh, wow. This is going south fast, isn't it?
Do not do that. Do not do that. Consult your accountant.
Right.
But actually, so what you just mentioned, Gordon, kind of piqued my interest, though, because from time to time, I'll hear people say, well, if you're thinking about forming an entity like an LLC, talk to your tax advisor.
Yeah.
Should we talk to a tax advisor, an attorney? Like, who should we actually talk to?
Both.
Okay.
I mean, there are tax consequences to forming entities, and frankly, there are tax reasons why forming an entity can be very positive. If you are in a fairly high tax bracket, for example, keeping your money in the business where it's taxed at the corporate tax level could be beneficial. Whereas if you're in a lower bracket, it may not make sense, and you may be spending money you shouldn't. Sort of depends. But I think if you're running it as a business, and for editors, I think you are running a business. It makes sense, for the average podcaster for the amateur podcaster who's just doing it as a hobby, having fun, maybe making a few bucks from, ad sales or something like that, that's where I start to say, well, does it really make sense? Just run it through your personal taxes. But for you guys with multiple clients and stuff, it makes a lot of sense to form that entity. And, you just want to know what you're going to have to do at tax time, because that is an additional expense, is paying for either preparing or paying for someone to prepare the tax return for the business.
Yeah. And I know for both Daniel and I, we're in Tennessee. And so I looked into it. I'm not set up as an LLC. Daniel is, if I remember right. And it's not as expensive as California, but it's not free. And
right.
So that is a consideration for me, where this is my side business. So part of me is going, how much do I want to invest to set that up?
Yeah. Yeah. But the cost of doing business, that's a factor. Absolutely. And if you say, as you say, it's a side hustle, when it gets big enough to take over, maybe that's when you think about it. I will say one thing: if you're going to form an entity, earlier is better, because at some point you're transferring assets and you're having to do a lot of paperwork to move things into the company. Whereas if you're starting up, once everything is under the company umbrella once it's in existence. So if you're thinking about it, I'd say do it, unless it really doesn't make financial sense.
So when I went to start my LLC, basically I went to the Secretary of State website for the state of Kentucky, and that's where I started. Is that the right way to do it? Probably not.
It's one right way to do it. There's a multitude of right ways. There are service providers out there. Look, you can hire a lawyer like me. I'm going to charge you a fair bit to do it. What I do is I turn over a really turnkey operation with a list of, here's what you do next, and sign here and check this and mail this to so-and-so. And, it's all sort of laid out in one fell swoop. When you do the Secretary of State approach, you then had to go to the IRS website and get a tax ID number. And then you had to file this paper. And then you had to follow up with that and write the operating agreement yourself, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
You could use I'm going to call them the online vending machine model. Companies with words like Rocket and Zoom in their names. I kind of liken it to getting a haircut from a vending machine. You might come out looking good. You might come out missing an ear. I get hired to fix people's stuff that they didn't get right, because you don't know how to answer the question on the form. Right. You might need some guidance there, and they don't have anybody to give you that guidance. So, if you look, most of us are smart people, and we can read the instructions and think about it. If we don't know, we're not going to check the wrong box and just say, oh, well, it'll work, but that does happen. And so, I would say, there are corporation startup companies that specialize in that. I like those better than the generic vending machine ones. And I'm not going to name names, but I have the ones I prefer. And in fact, I actually use one when I do a corporation. I have they serve lawyers specifically, and they provide about half of the steps, sort of in an organized fashion that makes it easier for us to do our part. So, and some of those also have a client facing side as well.
And if somebody was wanting to talk to you about this, do you only do corporations in California, or are you able to do nationwide? Like, what's your...
I can do them anywhere in the country, actually anywhere in the world. I do, like I said, I use these services that do have people that I can, talk to in the various states. If I have questions, or I need to have something that's specific to, say, Nebraska, they actually make it possible for me to associate with somebody in Nebraska. So yeah, we lawyers are able to cross state lines to a certain extent about that kind of stuff. I like to say, as long as the show or the client has some nexus to California, where I practice, and let's face it, this is entertainment. There's an entertainment industry. It happens to be in California. I think that's enough of a nexus to let me do this kind of work there.
So we had a question come up from Heather Wester. She asked, can you provide a scenario where I would want to register as LLC over sole proprietorship?
Sure. You're doing business. That's the scenario. I'm sorry. We sort of went over this already, but the idea is, look, as a sole proprietorship, if something happens in the business, let's say you make a big mistake and a guest is embarrassed and sues the podcaster, and the podcaster sues you and wins. Well, now you got to pay that judgment. And maybe you have the cash in the bank to just pay it, or maybe you don't. If you don't, what happens is that podcaster or the guest lawyer comes looking for your assets. And they'll start with asking you questions like, give me a list of all your bank accounts. Who holds the mortgage on your house? And you can see where that's going, right? They're going to end up putting a lien on your house until you pay off this judgment. If you have an entity, only what the entity owns is exposed to that liability. So yeah, you might end up having your editing gear, a lien on your Mac or something like that. And what's in the bank accounts, but it's much less putting your personal finances at risk. So that's the big reason for doing it. And really just keeping things separate and having the business be the party to the contract rather than you, the individual. So if there's a breach of contract, they're looking to the business, and your business insurance might pay, but you're not going to have to reach into your own personal bank account necessarily. So that's the big scenario, I would say.
We also had a question about what kinds of documentation would be needed. Is that so like if you're wanting to form an LLC, what kinds of things do you need to have prepared? Or is there even any value in having stuff prepared?
You don't really need much. I mean, to form a company, you're telling the government of whatever state, here I am, here's the name of the company I'm going to operate, here's how much money I'm putting into the business to start up, which, usually just a few $1,000 of capitalization. And here's our address and here's who to reach if you need to reach us, the agent for service of process. It's really, the initial filing with the state is 1 page long for either a corporation or an LLC. And in California, it's actually an online form nowadays. Many states, it's an online form. You fill it out, you pay the little fee, and a week goes by and you get a certificate. Great. Now you're a company. What you need then is for an LLC, it's called an operating agreement. In a corporation, it's called the bylaws. And this is the constitution, the rules that the company operates under. And then you need a tax ID number, and you need to open your bank accounts, and then you need contracts with your vendors and your clients. And it isn't a giant rocket science kind of a thing. Now, if you're getting into a situation where you have multiple owners and you've got maybe investors and things like that, it gets more complicated. That's another one of the nice things about the LLC or corporation structures is it gives you the flexibility to do that. If you need to bring in investors to fund your operations, you can. And you use you sell shares or membership interests in the company. That's not going to come up for most small business owners, but it can happen. And if you're in business with another partner or partners, using the LLC to define that relationship and what happens if things go wrong or somebody decides to leave, that's all built into the operating agreement as well. How do you buy somebody out? How do they buy you out? Those kinds of things. I would say that's a good, if you are getting into business with another person, whether you're related to that person or not. I've seen husband and wives have this situation too. The LLC operates a little bit like a prenuptial agreement.
All right. Heather has a question that Carrie is going to pop up on the screen. Maybe.
Sure she is.
There we go. If I'm purchasing from your website and utilizing your service, does this make you my lawyer?
Great question. No. Just like if you go to the library and buy a book by a lawyer, and borrow a book by a lawyer and read it and do what they say. They didn't hire the lawyer. You read what they had to say. Look, I want you to rely to a certain extent on what I say and do, but I don't want you to rely in a way that hurts you. So sometimes what I end up saying is, this is the general rule. If you have a special situation, you need to get a lawyer. I'll give you the vanilla ice cream. If you want a special kind of sundae or a banana split, hire someone to make it for you.
I had sort of another question. It's really about, well, that was dumb to say that I have another question. if my editing mind is going nuts right now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
No, let's leave it in because we want to be transparent about what kind of a person Brian is. No.
Yeah, that's great. You're going to fit right in here, Gordon. So working with clients, most of my clients are US based. And occasionally they will have guests that are overseas and might be covered under something like GDPR.
Yeah.
What are the kinds of things that we would need to have in place or think about as editors?
Wow. Actually, not much as editors. The GDPR is a privacy protection rule in the European Union. And I have my doubts about whether or not a recording of a person's voice is subject to the GDPR. Well, the basic rules with GDPR is if you're collecting personally identifiable information about a subject, somebody who lives in the EU, you're supposed to be able to tell them what you're collecting, why you're collecting it, what you're going to do with it, who else you're going to share it with, and you're supposed to give them a right to modify or delete that information. I don't think that the words that a person says in a recorded conversation necessarily falls into that personally identifiable information. Gosh, I can't speak tonight. Rented lips. That's it. Except that if that person tells you their email address or where they live or something, very sort of private, and they ask you to take it out, I think that if they're a GDPR subject, I think you have to sort of abide by that in order to avoid this problem. You're really just using good judgment. But as editors, I don't think you have to be affirmatively on the lookout for that stuff. That's the guests, not the guests, that's the podcaster's responsibility. And the guests will reach out to the podcaster. They don't even know who you are in most instances.
So no need for like a data processing agreement or anything.
Oh, well, if you are doing regular business with a podcaster who's in Europe and they're sharing information across international boundaries, then yes, but it's incumbent on them to have the data processing agreement. You become there's a name for it. I think it's a data processing provider. And yeah, you would have to abide by the terms of that agreement that they would need from you. But I don't think it's incumbent on you as an American podcast editor to be proactive about that unless you're seeking out that business on a large scale.
Wow. Thank you.
I mean, be careful about people's private stuff, but yeah.
One of the other things that I think has been a hot topic this year has been the California privacy law, and then also some recent changes to the Children's Online Privacy Act, or at least the application as I understand it.
Yeah.
Do we as editors need to concern ourselves with that?
So I would say same answer as what I said before is, you want to be mindful, you want to be aware of it. But again, you are not the end user and producer of this content. California privacy. I'm trying to think. I don't see how it would come up very much. I mean, you're not the one who's running a website collecting somebody's email address or something like that. I mean, if you are, then you have to think about it. That's more likely to be for your own business than for your clients, right? Unless you're a broader kind of service agency providing a big raft of services, in which case, yeah, you got to get some advice and figure this stuff out. But no, just as editors, I wouldn't make it a big point of concern.
Wow, that's very relieving, because that's something that I've felt is something that I needed to get tied up, honestly. But it's been a revenue play, right? Because you've always got to go that risk revenue thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe there's something I'm missing about the editing business, but I don't think you're collecting a lot of personal information from people.
No.
I collect as little as possible.
Right. I mean, you've got the name and maybe an email address and a phone number or how to contact the person. That's just coming across because you're at the same time as you're editing it, you're consuming that audio, right? But you're not in the business of storing and archiving that kind of information, except within the content of the episode. So, yeah.
Are there any things that you would expect to see editors missing on a sort of a common basis in terms of any legal exposure?
Well, I don't know. I think most of you folks are pretty astute about this stuff, but copyright in material that you're incorporating into the show. Music is an obvious one. I'm sure we're going to talk about music, but let's talk about like sound effects, right? If somebody wants to if you're as part of your editing package of services, you're going to introduce little bumpers and tags and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
You got me.
I know that one.
Came with the Roadcaster.
Roadcaster Pro.
That kind of stuff is, someone owns a copyright in that recording. And so you do need to think about it. Now that piece happens to be licensed as part of the Roadcaster package and whatever else. But if you're using sound effects that you go out and find on the web, you got to know that what you're doing is okay by the license terms. Most of the time when you purchase the sound effect, it's for one-time use for, one particular project or something like that. So, this is an issue that I'm seeing a lot with some of the music libraries. People are using it as the intro for their show when the license actually says one-time use. So they're supposed to pay for that every time for every new episode. So it's not.
Whenever
really
I see somebody
free.
whenever I see somebody mention like Audio Jungle, it's like it's only $20. Well, it's $20 for a one-time use, but you need to pay like $80 to $100 to get that unlimited download license. If
they even offer it, and some clips they do, and some they don't. So, so the same is true for snippets, audio bumpers, and taglines, and what do you call them? Production elements. So if you're doing that kind of stuff, make sure the library you have allows you to do it not just for your own stuff, but for third-party product as well. Because when you're doing it for someone else, now it's a commercial venture kind of thing. Other things that commonly missed in this space, I don't know. I haven't. I mean, I would say it's mostly going to do with those elements that end up getting heard by the audience.
I think maybe there's a little further to go with that copyright thing, and it was one of the things that we had planned to talk about.
Yeah,
we talked about being sure that elements that we provide for our clients, assuming that we do that, that's not actually something that I do.
Yeah.
But how concerned do we need to be about elements that they send us, whether it's a pre-produced intro or a sound effect or a snippet from TV?
Right? Well, that's back to the contract between you and your client. That should be something that's in there. Is you, the client, promise and warrant and represent that all of the content you send us for inclusion in your show is properly licensed, that you control or have acquired the rights to use that material, and you promise to indemnify and hold me, the editor, harmless against any breaches of that warranty. So that's it's your protection. One thing I should say about indemnity is an indemnification is a nice thing to have in a contract, but it's really only as good or as useful as the financial backing of the person who's giving it. So asking an 18-year-old college kid to indemnify you for something that they say that hurts somebody's feelings or causes them, whatever, is only, if that kid's got money in the bank, great. But if not, you're still on the hook. So in that space, insurance is another thing I think needs to be a part of the conversation. Is someone should be carrying liability insurance, errors and omissions insurance, if the show is the kind of thing that's going to be risky. If it's just an interview show, there may not be a lot of risk. And on that, maybe the insurance shouldn't cost very much either. So it's worth thinking about. Asking them if they have insurance, and if they do, to name you as an additional insured is probably a good idea. Went down a little bit of a path there. So back to your question, Brian, what else when the material they send you, they should be promising that they own or control or have the right to use it. That's the bottom line.
And what if they ask you if it's okay? Because I'd
actually had that happen. You shouldn't be in the business of giving people legal advice.
Right.
You can ask, you tell me, do you have a contract that says you can use it? Or do you have a legal, do you have some basis for wanting to use it? And look, there's a lot of the fair use discussion out there. People think,
I was going to ask you about that just because it's a fun topic to talk about.
Oh yeah, it's so much fun. It's, that kind of stuff. Well, look, if they say, I think it's fair use, unless you really know it's not, I think you can reasonably rely on their promise that, again, they have the right or the good faith belief that they have the right to use it. You don't have to be second guessing them as long as they're legit, saying it. But if they come and ask you, hey, do you think I can use this stuff? I think you got to say, hey, I'm not a lawyer. Talk to Gordon. No. Well, but they need to make these decisions for themselves. Otherwise, yeah, you do put yourself in a position of liability for giving that kind of advice or recommendation. I mean, obviously, you want to be helpful, but at the same time, you don't want to put yourself at risk.
Yeah. So, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Daniel.
So a comment from Heather. She said to always reach out for specific license information. Each license is different, reflecting on my recent experience with Audio Jungle.
Yeah.
So my question with that is, should we be doing that, or should it just be like in our contract says like the client promises to have permission, and does asking for that license kind of make us liable?
I don't think it makes you liable. It does open up the conversation. I mean, ultimately, I think it's incumbent on the client to provide you with properly licensed content. And you need to just say that. I don't think you need to see the license or read it or draw your own conclusions about it. And I think the less you engage in that, probably the better. But then for material you're using, if you go out and grab something, you got to do the same thing. You've got to assure them that what you're incorporating is legal and legit. So I guess the answer is yes.
I had a former client now who wanted to use licensed material in every single episode. They were going to change the closing song every single time. And I was like, I'm sorry, I'm not working on this. I'm just not. Good luck with that, but I'm not going to put myself in that position.
Right. I mean, technically, you could have been liable for part of that infringement. And, the worst thing that could happen is have a lot of finger pointing and having to defend yourself, even if you're not responsible for it. It's a colossal expense and hassle and headache. So, I mean, that seems like that was the right choice, just to say, I'm not going to do that. Find someone else. On the other hand, if they come and say we got the rights or we don't need the rights because it's fair use, again, unless you're really sure it's not, you're probably okay. Yeah. Well, they weren't fair use. I mean, it's different if they're doing a show about, great guitar licks and they play a clip of Stevie Ray Vaughan.
Okay, that's relevant.
It's relevant, and it's a critique and commentary about the thing. That's more likely to be. Again, I don't want to get into legal advice about what fair use is, but we can talk about the four factors and how you do the analysis, but ultimately you have to do it on each individual alleged infringement.
So these kinds of infringements, if there was something that did happen to come up and there was is this something that would be covered by the errors and omissions insurance type thing that you discussed, or like? Yeah, that's what errors and omissions insurance is. Exactly that. It's designed to cover the podcaster and anybody else named on the policy against their own mistakes and failure to do what they're supposed to do. Again, unless it's an intentional act. Insurance generally doesn't cover you for intentional stuff.
Imagine that.
Yeah. So knowingly using a piece of music when you know it's not fair use, that arguably could be deemed an intentional infringement. But I think most of the time they defend the case, and there's a colorable claim in many of these situations.
So for those of us that are hearing about errors and omissions insurance, but maybe don't have it yet, that's going to be 99.9%. Well, it's at least 25% of the people on the screen right now. I don't know about everybody else, but is there
only 75?
Is this something that we could get at just any insurance company?
No.
Okay. So
the reason I said it's such a giant percentage of people who don't have it is that it's very hard to find. And the insurance companies haven't been very interested in doing policies for podcast. Look, if you're Spotify, they're writing policies to cover that kind of stuff because they're producing tons of content. Likewise, NPR, the big podcast outfits are doing it. Where do you find it? There, I honestly don't know. I mean, I know one broker who sort of talks about it, but I don't know what the policy, premiums and limits are like. I'm actually sort of trying to talk to other brokers and carriers about this to try to find the solution. But so far, they don't seem to be that interested. And so right now, it's a nice idea. It's hard to implement.
Yeah.
Actually, that might be something that you guys as a community could wield some power and go to the insurance community. If you're interested, go to the insurance community and say, this is something we all need. What can we do?
Should the editors have it, or should the podcasters have it, or both?
I think both.
Okay.
I think if you have your own policy, it can be secondary to the podcast producers' insurance, but it probably does make sense just to have that protection in case you do get sued. That's really what it's about. Is if you get sued, who's going to pay the lawyers?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
All right.
Mm-hmm. What else?
I'm kind of stuck still on this errors and omissions thing. So
Okay.
because
Look, I'm going to be honest. I thought you were saying Arizona missions.
No. Yes, Father Sarah had a big role in podcasting.
There you go.
and the reason is because I've done a couple of searches, and typically when I search for errors and omissions, I'll find one of those insurance companies like Next or somebody else that has a nice big landing page. But when I go to get the insurance, it appears to be basically just business insurance.
Well, there are different flavors of E&O, so we're talking about media errors and omissions. So if you're going to Google it, add the word media into the search.
Good to know.
That's going to narrow your field a lot. And I think there's one company called Hiscox, I think, that does write some policies like this. And I'm pretty sure that Chubb and Fireman's Fund, the big name insurance companies, will do it if the broker puts it to them the right way. It's really, is it profitable for brokers to do it? And I don't think the business model's there yet.
Okay. Because I have business insurance, but I don't even know what it covers.
Yeah. I think it's HISCOX, something like that, or maybe COCKS.
Okay. For those that don't know, we've got a chat stream going backstage, and I'm asking how to spell it.
We don't know.
But it's interesting because I did actually talk to one of the lawyers at Pandora a couple months ago. It was right after the pandemic started keeping us all at home, and the conversation was around, is this even something that exists, and is it possible? And the thinking was that the big companies were going to be requiring it. If you're going to have your show acquired or hosted on one of these big platforms, you need to have this insurance. So yeah, nice job. So it may be coming. It's just sort of something to keep around, keep an eye on, I guess is what I'm saying.
So Gordon, podcast lawyer.
Yeah.
How can you help us? For the person listening, I have your book on the shelf. I've read through that. I need to probably read through it again. But what other ways do you help podcasters? Well,
I sort of offer a multi-level approach. So, look, I have a free podcast guest release. If a podcaster is bringing guests on their show, they should have a written document with each of those guests. It can be an online form, but the point being that guest needs to be given consent to be recorded and what the scope of that consent covers, that you can use it in these ways in this territory around for this long a period of time. I like to say all media now known, hereafter devised, throughout the universe in perpetuity. But some guests may object to that or whatever, and that they're not getting paid, or if they are, then it needs to specify how much they're getting paid, and that they promise not to sue you for anything related to the podcast or their appearance on your show. So that's offered for free. It's at podcastrelease.com. And then I do offer the ebook, which is the podcastlawbook.com. Just podcast law book, not the. And then the forms. I have a bunch of legal templates and forms and things like that for special needs, special situations that might come up. The podcast prenup, the co-host agreements, things like that, an independent contractor agreement to use with your vendors, all those kinds of things. Those are available on the website at podcastlawforms.com. All of this is on the gordonfiremark.com site, but podcast law forms for the legal docs. And I also, it's available as a bundle or a la carte forms. And then I also have the Podcasters Legal and Business Boot Camp, which is it's been a Saturday morning 3 to 4 hour live session where I sort of walk people through forming their company, doing their trademark, getting their copyrights registered, what to watch out for, advertiser agreements, all that kind of stuff. And that one's going to be offered again. This time it's going to be as an online course. So you can do it at your own pace, starting in mid-September. So come on over to gordonfiremark.com and give me your email address, and I'll tell you about that when the time comes. Get the free release, and that'll put you on the mailing list. That's the best way.
And you have a podcast as well, you mentioned. So what's your podcast?
Oh, entertainmentlawupdate.com. That's where I talk to other lawyers and lawyers and students and professionals in the entertainment industry about cases and things that are going on in the entertainment business. And my co-host and I have a great time. Once a month, we do that show. A lot of fun.
And if you haven't been taking notes, we're going to make sure all those links can be found in the show notes.
Go to Gordon Firemark, my name, gordonfiremark.com, and everything else is on that page. So
there you go. And you can also find all the information we talked about on this episode at podcasteditorsmastermind.com.
Daniel, since you mentioned podcasteditormastermind.com, why don't you tell people how they can be a guest?
All you got to do is go to podcasteditorsmastermind.com, and there is a button at the top of the page that says be a guest. Fill out the form, and then we'll contact you. Simple as that.
What do you know? Anything else you'd like?
When he does it.
And we don't only talk to experts about podcasting. You know, this mastermind is designed to help people and help you get over your struggles, get over your hurdles. So if you are a podcast editor who is struggling with business side of things or just kind of thing that we can help with, come on the show and then we can just kind of workshop and help you figure out what you're struggling with.
And if you're interested in being in a mastermind, let us know that. We'll connect you with some folks. We're starting to put some pieces together. I know in the Just Busters female podcast editor group, we're starting to form mastermind. So if this is something you'd want to be a part of in general, let us know. We'll connect you with some other people that you could do a ongoing chat with throughout the day, where if you blink, you've missed 200 messages. So that's our little group.
Yep.
Well, Gordon, thank you so much again. Heather says so much good stuff. This episode went by too quickly. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Heather, for being here with us.
Thanks. It's been a lot of fun. I've been looking forward to it all week.
Awesome. Well, I'm Jennifer Longworth with Bourbon Barrel Podcasting, bourbonbarrelpodcasting.com. You can find me on social media at KY Podcasting.
I'm Brian Ensminger. You can find me at toptieraudio.com, and all the links are there.
I'm Daniel Abendroth, and you can find me at rothmedia.audio.
And Carrie Caulfield Eric has been our chat mod, and she is at yayapodcasting.com. And our guest again?
GordonFiremark.com.
Thanks, everyone. We look forward to seeing you again in a couple weeks.